Alright, so imagine this for a second. Acts chapter 16. Paul's now on his second missionary journey, moving into new territory, Philippi, a major Roman city. Everything looks like another step forward, right? But this story isn't really about where he goes. It's about what happens when things go very, very wrong and how he responds in that moment. Because honestly, what Paul and Silas do in the middle of suffering, it's unexpected. And yeah, kind of confronting too. Alright, so before we step into Philippi, we kind of need to zoom out for a second, because Paul didn't just randomly end up there. His story, honestly, it's already pretty intense before we even get to Acts 16. So, Paul, originally, he's not a fan of Christians, like, at all. He's a devout Jew, deeply committed, very serious about the law, and he genuinely believes that this whole movement about Jesus is dangerous. In his mind, it's not just wrong, it's offensive to God. So he goes after Christians, he persecutes them, he's on a mission to shut it all down, and then, well, everything changes. He has this encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And it's not subtle, it's not gradual, it's immediate. He realizes Jesus really is the Messiah, and that realization flips his entire life upside down. From that moment on, Paul goes from being a persecutor of Christians to becoming one himself. Not just that he becomes one of the most passionate voices for the gospel, but here's the thing, it doesn't all happen overnight in terms of ministry. After his conversion, Paul actually spends about 10 years kind of off the radar. He's in the Arabian desert for a long stretch, and later he spends time in Jerusalem, connecting with the other disciples. And during that time, God is preparing him and shaping him, getting him ready for what's ahead. Because eventually, Paul is going to go on these missionary journeys, 3 of them, actually that take him across regions, into cities, into completely different cultures, on sharing the message of Jesus. The first journey, yeah, we've already seen that. It's recorded in Acts chapters 13 and 14. Paul travels with Barnabas, and they go through parts of Asia Minor, preaching, teaching, planting churches, and like you might expect, it's kind of a mixed response. Some people believe, but a lot reject the message. After that first journey, Paul comes back to Antioch in Syria, the church that originally sent him out, and he stays there for about a year. You can almost picture it. Right? Just regrouping, resting, reconnecting, maybe processing everything that just happened, but then he's ready to go again. And this time, things look a little different. Barnabas, his original partner, they end up going separate ways. Barnabas takes his cousin John Mark, and they head off on their own journey. Meanwhile, Paul gathers a new group of companions for what becomes his second missionary journey. First, there's Silas. He's a respected leader from the church in Jerusalem, a Jewish believer, someone solid and trusted. He becomes Paul's main traveling partner on this trip. Then, about halfway through the journey, Paul meets Timothy. And this part's kind of interesting. Timothy's young. Like, really young, around 15 years old. He has a Jewish mother and grandmother who raised him in the scriptures, but his father is Greek, so he's coming from a mixed background. And Paul sees something in him. He doesn't just see potential, he sees someone he wants to invest in. So Timothy becomes, in a way, his protege. He brings him along on the journey, starts mentoring him, walking with him. And later on, Timothy's going to become a leader himself, even pastoring a church in Ephesus. Paul will write letters to him, what we know as 1st and 2nd Timothy. And then there's one more person traveling with them. And this one's easy to miss at first. Luke. Now, Luke is the one writing the book of Acts. He's a Gentile, not Jewish, and he doesn't just come out and say, hey, I'm here now. He does something a little more subtle. Up until a certain point, he's telling the story using words like they and them, you know, describing what Paul and the others are doing from a bit of a distance. But then right here in Acts 16, something shifts. All of a sudden, the language changes. He starts saying we, us, and it's like, wait, hold on. That means he's there. He's joined them. He's part of the journey now. It's a small detail, but it actually matters. Because now, the story isn't just being reported, it's being experienced firsthand. So now you've got this group: Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke. And together, they make their way into a new region, Macedonia, which in modern terms is basically Greece. And they arrive in a city called Philippi. Now, Philippi isn't just any city. It's a prominent Roman colony. In fact, it's kind of a big deal, almost like a miniature version of Rome itself. It was developed by Philip II of Macedon, who, by the way, was the father of Alexander the Great. So there's history there. Influence, prestige. This is not some small, quiet town. You'd expect it to be full of activity, culture, maybe even religious life. But here's where things get a little unexpected. When Paul typically enters a city, his first move is to go to the synagogue. That's his pattern. He starts with the Jewish community, shares the message there, and then moves outward, except in Philippi. There's no synagogue, and that actually tells us something important. In order for a synagogue to exist, you needed at least 10 Jewish men living in the city. So the absence of a synagogue means there are fewer than 10. In other words, there's barely any Jewish presence at all. So Paul can't follow his usual routine. Instead, he goes down to a river outside the city, because in places without a synagogue, people would sometimes gather by the water for prayer, and that's where everything begins here. He and his companions sit down, and they start speaking with a group of women who have gathered there. And among them, there's one woman in particular. Her name is Lydia. She's from the city of Thyatira, and she's a seller of purple, basically. She deals in luxury goods, expensive fabrics. So she's likely a successful businesswoman. She's already someone who worships God, but as she listens to Paul, something shifts. The message lands, and we're told that the Lord opens her heart to respond. She believes, and not just her whole household ends up being baptized as well, which means right here, in this moment, by a river outside Philippi, Lydia becomes the first recorded convert on European soil. And honestly, it's kind of a quiet beginning. No big crowds, no dramatic scene, just a conversation, a heart opening, and a life changed. But it's about to lead into something much bigger. So picture that moment by the river for a second. It's quiet, not a huge crowd, not some dramatic scene, just a few people gathered for prayer. And Paul sits down and starts talking with them, just sharing about Jesus in a very normal conversational way. And among those listening is Lydia. Now, Lydia's interesting. She's not just anyone passing by, she's a businesswoman. She deals in purple cloth, which in that world meant luxury, expensive, high-end. So she's likely successful, established, someone with influence, at least in her circle. But more than that, she's already someone who worships God. She's spiritually open. She's seeking, in a sense. And as she listens to Paul, something happens that you can't really manufacture. We're told that the Lord opened her heart. And I love that detail because it's not just about information, it's transformation. It's not like Paul said something especially persuasive or clever. It's that God was working in her heart as she listened. And she responds, she believes, and not just her whole household ends up being baptized too. So whatever shift happened in her, it ripples outward. It affects the people around her, her home, her influence. And she immediately does something else that kind of shows where her heart is. She insists that Paul and his companions come stay at her house. It's like, if you really believe I'm serious about following the Lord, then come let me show you hospitality. And she persuades them. So right there, in this quiet moment by the river, you have the first recorded conversion in Europe. And it doesn't look like much at first glance. No crowd, no big event, just a conversation, and a heart that was ready. But then, things shift. Because as they keep going back to that place of prayer, probably the same river area, they run into someone very different. A slave girl. And her situation, it's honestly kind of heavy. She's not just a slave, which already means she has no real freedom, no control over her life. but she's also possessed by what the text calls a spirit of divination, which basically means she has this ability to tell fortunes, to predict things, or at least appear to. And because of that, she's making a lot of money, not for herself, but for her owners. So you've got this layered situation where she's being exploited in more than one way. There's the obvious part she's owned by people who are profiting off of her, but then there's this deeper spiritual level too, like she's under the influence of something dark, something that's using her, just like her owners are. And you kind of get the sense that she's caught in the middle of all of it, like she doesn't have a framework for what's right or wrong here. She's not Jewish, so she wouldn't know the law, like she's not a follower of Jesus, at least not yet, so she doesn't have that perspective either. She's just doing what she's been pulled into. And then she starts following Paul and the others, day after day, and this is where it gets a little strange, because what she's saying, on the surface, it actually sounds right. She's going around shouting something like, "These men are servants of the Most High God. They're telling you the way of salvation," and you hear that, and you think, wait, isn't that true? I mean, technically, yes. Paul and his companions are servants of the Most High God. They are sharing the message of salvation, so why does this become a problem? Well, this is where the contradiction comes in. Because even though the words sound correct, the source is completely off. You've got someone who's under the influence of a demonic spirit, trying to, in a way, advertise the message of the gospel. And that just doesn't line up. It's like, the message is right, but the messenger is completely out of place. And that creates confusion. On top of that, there's likely a deeper issue with how her words would have been understood by the people around them. In a Greco-Roman context, when she says Most High God, people might not be thinking of the God of Israel, they might be thinking of Zeus or one of their own deities. So now you've got this mix of truth and misunderstanding, and it's muddying the message. And then there's just the sheer repetition of it all, because this isn't a one-time thing. It says she did this for many days. Can you imagine that everywhere you go, someone's following you, loudly repeating the same thing over and over and over again, even if it sounds positive at first? Eventually, it becomes distracting, overwhelming. It starts pulling attention away from what's actually happening. So now, instead of people focusing on the message Paul is trying to share, they're focused on her, and the whole situation just feels off. It's like something's not right, even if you can't immediately explain why. And that tension keeps building, day after day, until finally it reaches a breaking point. But at this stage in the story, what you really see is this contrast. On one side, Lydia, a woman whose heart is opened, who responds quietly but deeply, whose life begins to change from the inside out. And on the other side, this slave girl, someone whose life is controlled from the outside in, pulled by forces she doesn't understand, caught in exploitation and spiritual darkness. Both are in the same city, both encounter the same message, but their starting points couldn't be more different. And you can kind of feel something is about to happen here, something that's going to shift the direction of everything that follows. So after days of this, literally days of this girl following them around, shouting the same thing over and over, something finally shifts. And if you're being honest, you can kind of understand why Paul didn't react right away. I mean, sometimes when something's annoying, you just wait it out, right? You hope it'll stop on its own. You don't want to confront every situation immediately. You give it time, thinking maybe it'll just fade away, but it doesn't. She keeps going, day after day after day, and eventually, Paul reaches a point where he can't ignore it anymore. The text actually says he was greatly annoyed. Now that might sound almost too simple, like really annoyed, but it's more than just irritation. It's that sense that something is wrong, something is off, and it's starting to interfere with what God is doing. So Paul turns, not even to the girl, but to the spirit behind it. And he says, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And just like that, it does. Immediately. No long process, no struggle, the spirit leaves her. And what just happened there is actually a big deal, because this wasn't just about stopping something annoying. There were deeper reasons why Paul had to act. First, there was a theological issue. Even though what she was saying sounded right on the surface, it wasn't necessarily being understood correctly. There's a strong possibility that when she said the way of salvation, it could have been interpreted as a way of salvation, and that's a huge difference. Because if people hear that and think, oh, this is just one option among many, then the whole message of the gospel gets diluted. Paul can't let that stand. And then there's the cultural layer. When she says Most High God in a Greco-Roman setting, people might not be thinking of the one true God, they might be thinking of their own gods, like Zeus. So now the message is getting mixed up with their existing beliefs. It's like truth is being filtered through the wrong lens, and that creates confusion. So even though the words sound good, the meaning is off. And Paul knows that matters, but it's not just theology. There's also the fact that she's a distraction. Because imagine trying to have meaningful conversations with people, trying to explain something as important as the message of Jesus, and there's someone right behind you, constantly shouting, even if what they're saying sounds supportive at first. After a while, it becomes overwhelming. People stop focusing on the message and start focusing on the noise. And instead of drawing people in, it actually pushes them away, you know? So now, what could have been a moment of connection becomes chaotic. And Paul can't let that continue either. But then there's one more layer, and this one's kind of obvious when you think about it. This is just bad advertising. I mean, think about it. You've got someone who is clearly under the influence of something dark, following you around, acting in a way that doesn't line up with the message you're bringing, and trying to represent what you stand for. That's not helpful. That's confusing. It actually undermines everything, and because the gospel is about freedom, about truth, about being set free, and here you have someone who is clearly not free trying to promote it, and people are going to notice that disconnect. So at some point, Paul has to draw a line, and when he does, when he commands that spirit to leave, it changes everything, because now the girl is free. But her owners, they're not celebrating, not even close. Because for them, this was never about her well-being. It was about money. She was making them profit, a lot of it. And the moment that spirit leaves her, so does her ability to tell fortunes, which means their business is gone, just like that. And they are furious. So instead of seeing this as a moment of healing or restoration, they see it as a loss, a financial loss, and they want someone to pay for it. So they grab Paul and Silas, specifically them, and drag them into the marketplace, straight to the authorities. And what's interesting is, they don't even bring up the real reason. They don't say, hey, these guys just cost us our income. Instead, they twist it. They frame it in a way that will get attention. They say, these men are Jews, and they're causing trouble in our city. They're teaching customs that aren't lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. And just like that, the situation escalates. Because now it's not just about two individuals, it's about identity, about culture, about stirring up fear, and the crowd joins in. Things get heated fast. The authorities don't really investigate. They don't slow things down. They just react. They tear the clothes off Paul and Silas, and they order them to be beaten with rods over and over. And when it says they were beaten, it's not light. This is severe. They're left wounded, bruised, likely bleeding. And after all of that, they're thrown into prison, but not just anywhere. They're placed in the inner prison, the most secure part, and their feet are fastened in stocks, which means they're not just locked in, they're immobilized, uncomfortable, restricted, completely confined. And just like that, everything has shifted. What started as a simple act of setting someone free has now turned into suffering for them. No trial, no defense, no explanation, just accusation, violence, and confinement. And that's where this part of the story leaves them. In chains, in the dark, in a place they didn't expect to be, simply because they did what was right. So now, just sit with this scene for a second. Paul and Silas have just been beaten. Not lightly, this was brutal. Stripped, struck over and over with rods. Their bodies probably torn up, bruised, bleeding. And then, as if that wasn't enough, they're thrown into prison. And not just anywhere in the prison. The inner cell, the deepest, darkest part. The place you don't get out of it. The place reserved for the most serious cases. And then their feet are locked into stocks, which means they're not just sitting there, they're fixed in place, unable to move, probably in an awkward, painful position. Every shift of their body would just remind them of the beating they just took. And this isn't their home. They're in a foreign city, Philippi, far from anything familiar. No support system. No legal protection in that moment. No guarantee of what's coming next. And that's really the part that kind of hangs over the whole scene. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if this ends in a miracle or if this ends in death. Because at this point in the early church, both have already happened. Some followers of Jesus have been miraculously delivered. Others have been killed for their faith. So Paul and Silas are sitting there in that prison, and they don't have the benefit of hindsight. They don't know how this story turns out. They don't know if they're about to be released or executed. And you try to put yourself in that moment. Like, really try. Because it's easy to read this quickly and move on. But if you slow it down, it starts to feel different. What would you be thinking? What would your mind be doing in that kind of situation? Because honestly, I think mine would go to some pretty dark places. I'd probably be replaying everything that just happened, wondering how it escalated so fast. Maybe questioning, did we do something wrong? Did we miss something? I'd be thinking about the future. Or whether there even is one. Thinking about people I love. Trying to make sense of it all. And yeah, I'd probably be praying. I think most people would, because when you're in a crisis like that, prayer almost becomes instinctive. It's like, okay, God, I need you right now. So the praying part, that makes sense. But then the story adds this detail, and this is where everything shifts. It says that around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing. And I don't know about you, but that's the part that kind of stops you. Because praying in that situation, sure, that feels natural. But singing after everything they just went through, that's different. That's not the reaction you expect. I mean, think about the timing. It's midnight. The middle of the night. Probably pitch dark in that inner cell. No light, no comfort, no relief, just pain, exhaustion, and uncertainty. And in that moment, they're singing, not complaining, not arguing, not spiraling into fear. They're singing. And the text even says that the other prisoners were listening to them, which means this wasn't quiet, under their breath humming. This was audible, noticeable, something that carried through the prison. And you can almost picture it, right? Other prisoners lying there in the dark, probably dealing with their own fear, their own guilt, their own despair. And then they hear this. Two men who were just beaten and chained, lifting their voices in prayer and in song. And it just doesn't make sense, at least not on the surface, because everything about their circumstances says this should be a moment of silence, or grief, or anger. But instead, it becomes a moment of worship. And that's where this starts to feel, honestly, a little uncomfortable, because it forces you to ask a question. Would I respond like that? Like, really, it's easy to say yes when you're not in that situation, and it's easy to imagine yourself being strong, being faithful, doing the right thing. But when you actually try to step into their shoes, it gets harder, because pain changes things. Uncertainty changes things. Fear has a way of reshaping how we respond. And if I'm being honest, I don't know. I don't know if my instinct in that moment would be to sing, pray. Yeah, probably. But sing, I think I'd be overwhelmed. I think I'd be trying to process what just happened, trying to figure out what comes next, maybe holding on to hope, but also wrestling with doubt. And yet, here they are, not just enduring the moment, but responding in a completely different way. And it's not fake. That's the thing. This isn't denial. It's not pretending everything is okay. Their situation is very real. Their pain is real. The uncertainty is real, but so is their relationship with God. And somehow, that relationship is strong enough that even in that environment, even in that moment, it leads them to worship, to sing. And the more you sit with that, the more it stands out. Because it's one thing to praise when life is going well, when things are stable, when prayers are being answered the way you hoped. When everything feels aligned, it's easy to sing then. But this This is different. This is praise in the middle of pain. This is worship in the middle of uncertainty. This is choosing to lift your voice when everything around you is telling you to stay silent. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because it reveals something deeper about who they are, about what they believe, about how they see God, not just in the good moments, but in the hardest ones. And honestly, it kind of lingers with you because it's not just a detail in a story. It's a window into a kind of faith that most of us are still trying to understand. A faith that doesn't collapse under pressure. A faith that doesn't disappear when circumstances turn. A faith that somehow still sings in the dark. And this is where the story kind of turns inward. Because it's not just about what Paul and Silas did. It's about what that reveals and what it asks of us. I mean, I found myself getting stuck right here, just sitting with this moment, because the more you think about it, the more it presses on you a little, like, how do you get to that place? How do you get to a place where, in the middle of everything falling apart, your response is not just prayer, but singing? And honestly, I had to turn it into a prayer. A really simple one. Lord, teach me to sing in the darkness, because that's exactly where they are. It's dark, literally. It's midnight. They're in the inner prison, which means there's probably no light at all. You can almost imagine it. Can't even see your hand in front of your face. Just silence. Maybe the sound of chains, the occasional movement from other prisoners. It's cold, it's uncomfortable, it's isolating. That's the physical reality, but there's also a deeper kind of darkness here. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. They've just been beaten, publicly humiliated, thrown into prison without a fair hearing. And now they're sitting there, not knowing what happens next. And that uncertainty, that's its own kind of weight, because sometimes it's not just the pain of what you're going through, it's the not knowing how it ends. Are they going to be released? Are they going to stay there indefinitely? Or are they going to be executed? They don't know. And that's not a hypothetical concern, because if you've been following the story in Acts, you've already seen both outcomes. In one case, Peter is thrown into prison and God miraculously delivers him. Sends an angel, opens the doors, leads him right out. But in that same chapter, James is killed. Same faith, same devotion, two completely different outcomes. So Paul and Silas are sitting there in that prison and they don't have any guarantee which way their story is going to go. It could end like Peter's, or it could end like James. And that's what makes their response so real. Because they're not singing with certainty of deliverance. They're not singing because they know everything's about to work out. They're singing without knowing. They're singing in the tension. And that's a very different kind of faith, because it means their worship isn't based on outcomes. It's not dependent on whether God rescues them in that moment. It's rooted in who God is, regardless of what happens next. And that's the part that challenges me, because if I'm being honest, a lot of times my worship is tied to my circumstances. When things are good, it's easy. When prayers are answered the way I hoped, it flows naturally. But when things are uncertain, when things feel heavy, or confusing, or just hard, that's when it gets quiet. That's when it becomes more difficult to lift your voice. And yet, here are Paul and Silas, sitting in a place where everything feels uncertain, and they're still choosing to sing. And I think that's why that simple prayer matters so much. Lord, teach me to sing in the darkness. Not just when things are clear. Not just when things are going well. But in the moments when you don't understand what's happening. When you don't know how it's going to turn out. when you're sitting in your own version of that inner prison. Because we all have those moments, right? Maybe not a literal prison, but seasons where things feel just as heavy, where the future feels uncertain, where you're trying to hold on to faith, but it's not easy. And the question becomes, what do you do in that space? Do you withdraw? Do you go silent? Or do you somehow learn to sing? And I don't think that kind of response comes from trying harder. I think it comes from knowing God more deeply, from having a relationship that isn't just built on good days, but one that holds steady even in the dark. Because if God is still good, even here, if he's still worthy, even now, then maybe, just maybe, there's still a reason to sing, even in the darkness. And this idea of singing in the darkness, it's not just something we see with Paul and Silas. It actually shows up again and again, even in the middle of some of the hardest moments in Scripture. There's this passage from the prophet Habakkuk that really captures it, and it's not written from a place of comfort. It's written during a time when everything is unraveling. The nation is under threat. Things are falling apart. There's fear, instability. Nothing feels secure. And Habakkuk says something that honestly feels almost upside down. He says, even if the fig tree doesn't blossom, even if there's no fruit on the vines, even if the fields produce no food, even if the flocks are gone and the stalls are empty, in other words, even if everything that normally sustains life is gone, even if everything is stripped away, he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Not because life is good, not because circumstances are easy, but because God is still God. And that's the same thread you see with Paul and Silas. It's not denial. It's not pretending things aren't hard. It's choosing to anchor yourself in something deeper than what's happening around you. And then you come across stories like this one, the story of Horatio and Anna Spafford. And this is one of those stories that it just stays with you because it's not theoretical, like it's real life. Horatio Spafford was a successful attorney in Chicago in the 1800s. By all accounts, he was doing well, financially stable, established. A good life. But then, in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire happened. And it wiped out a lot of what he had invested in. Real estate, property, gone. Just like that. So already, you have this massive loss. And then, a couple of years later, in 1873, he decides to send his wife, Anna, and their 4 daughters ahead of him on a trip to Europe. The idea was simple, just get away for a while. Rest, recover, try to breathe again after everything they'd been through. But on November 21st, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the ship they were on collided with another vessel, and it sank in about 20 minutes, and all 4 of their daughters drowned. Annie was 11, Maggie was 9, Bessie was 5, and little Tanetta, just 2 years old. Anna survived. She was found unconscious on a piece of floating debris. And when she was finally able to send word to her husband, the message was just 2 words: saved alone. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. So Horatio boards a ship to go meet his wife. And at some point during that journey, the captain tells him, we're now passing over the area where the ship went down. The place where his daughters died. And it's there, in that moment, that Horatio goes back to his cabin and he writes the words to the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. And you hear that, and it almost feels impossible. Because this isn't someone writing from comfort. This is a man standing in the middle of overwhelming grief. And yet, he writes, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. It is well with my soul. That's not surface level faith. That's someone who somehow learned how to sing in the darkness. But the story doesn't even end there. Because after they return to Chicago and try to rebuild their lives, they have more children, a son, and then 2 daughters. And then tragedy strikes again. Their young son dies at just 4 years old during a scarlet fever epidemic. So now you're looking at a couple who has lost everything financially and multiple children. And at that point, they decide they need a completely new beginning. So in 1881, they leave Chicago and they move to Jerusalem, not to escape everything, but to pour themselves into something meaningful. They gather with a small group of people from their church and form what becomes known as the American Colony. And instead of turning inward in their grief, they turn outward. They begin serving the local community, Jews and Arabs alike, helping people, supporting those in need. They even start an orphanage, which later grows into a children's hospital. So out of their loss comes care for others. Out of their pain comes compassion. And that legacy continues. That work didn't just stop with them, it carried on. Even generations later, their family remained involved. And when you look at that story, you realize something. Singing in the darkness doesn't mean the darkness isn't real. It doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means choosing to trust God in the middle of it, to keep your heart open, even when it's been broken, and somehow to let that pain become something that still points back to Him. And then something happens, right there in the middle of the night, after the praying, after the singing, after all of that quiet, steady faith in the dark, the ground starts to shake. A sudden earthquake, not small, not subtle, this is strong enough to rattle the entire prison. The foundations are shaken, the doors fly open, and every chain, every single one, comes loose. And for a moment, you can almost feel the chaos, because this isn't just a miracle, it's a situation. The jailer wakes up, sees the doors open, and immediately jumps to one conclusion. The prisoners are gone, and in his world, that's not just a mistake, that's a death sentence. If the prisoners escape, he pays for it with his life. So in that instant, without even checking, he draws his sword. He's about to end his own life. And then Paul shouts, loud enough to cut through the panic, "Do yourself no harm, we're all here." Oh, and that moment, it changes everything. Because think about it, they could have run, the doors were open, the chains were off, no one was stopping them, but they stayed. And not just Paul and Silas, it says all the prisoners were still there. Which is kind of incredible, if you think about it. Because something about what happened before the praying, the singing, the way they carried themselves in that darkness, it had already made an impact. People were listening, and now they're watching. So the jailer calls for a light, rushes in, and he's shaken. He's trembling, not just because of the earthquake, but because something deeper is happening. He falls down before Paul and Silas and asks a question that, honestly, cuts right to the center of everything. What must I do to be saved? And you can feel the weight of that moment, because this isn't theoretical anymore. This isn't curiosity. This is someone who just came face to face with his own mortality, and now he wants to know what really matters. What do I do? And Paul and Silas give him a simple answer. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved. Not complicated, not layered, just clear. And from there, they begin to speak more to him and to everyone in his house. Because this moment doesn't stop with him, it spreads. The jailer takes them, right then, in the middle of the night, and washes their wounds, the same wounds that were just inflicted on them hours earlier. There's this quiet reversal happening, and then he and his entire household are baptized, right there. That same night, and when he brings them into his home, he sets food before them, and there's this sense of joy that fills the space, because everything has changed, and it all traces back to that moment in the dark, to two men sitting in chains, choosing to pray and to sing, because the truth is, they weren't just enduring their situation, they were witnessing through it, and the people around them were paying attention. The other prisoners heard them. The jailer saw them. And what they experienced in that dark place, it opened the door for something much bigger than their own circumstances. It led someone else to ask the most important question they could ever ask. And maybe that's part of the point. That what we do in our darkest moments doesn't just stay with us. People are listening, people are watching. And sometimes the way we carry our faith in the dark becomes the very thing that leads someone else into the light. So maybe that's the takeaway to hold on to. Not just how to praise when life feels good, but how to keep that same song when it doesn't. When things are uncertain, heavy, or just dark. And if this stirred something in you, just sit with it for a bit. And hey, if you want more reflections like this, you can stick around. Maybe subscribe, but more than anything, just don't lose the song.